Lesson number 15 in a series of 24 lessons on the case for biblical Christianity. I've been discussing the doctrine of evolution and what evolutionists say. I want to begin this lesson by giving some quotations from prominent men concerning this hypothesis known as the doctrine of evolution. And these are scientists and leaders in their fields of endeavor. One of them, the first one, is Professor G.A. Kirkut of the Department of Physiology and Biochemistry at the University of Southampton, in the book Implications of Evolution, Pergamon Press, London, 1960, page 150. And Dr. Kirkut says, "It is therefore a matter of faith on the part of the biologist that biogenesis did occur." That means the beginning of life. And he can choose whatever method of biogenesis happens to suit him personally. The evidence for what did happen is not available. Now, Professor Kirkut is an evolutionist, but he admits that there is no support for that view. On page 157, Dr. Kirkut adds, "The notion that all living forms in the world evolved from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form, is not supported sufficiently by valid evidence to allow us to consider it as anything more than a working hypothesis." Now, Dr. Kirkut was not some kind of an upstart, but a distinguished, mature scientist, even though believing the doctrine of evolution, was objective enough and honest enough to admit that there was no support for it. Dr. Fred Hoyle, who perhaps is the world's greatest astronomer, and he's professor of astronomy at Cambridge University in England. And this is from him on Hoyle on Evolution in Nature, volume 294, and it's November 1981, page 105. And Dr. Hoyle, incidentally, was an evolutionist, but about 10 years ago, he and two of his colleagues, Chandra Wickramasinghe and Colin Patterson, both distinguished doctors in science in the British Isles, these three distinguished leaders among the evolutionists abandoned the evolutionary hypothesis, searching for a better explanation of the origin of things. And Dr. Hoyle, this great astronomer, said, "The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way," that is, talking about the evolutionary doctrine, "is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein." Dr. Hoyle is saying in this statement that saying that life forms evolved like evolutionists say they evolved would be just about as true as saying that a tornado going through a junkyard formed a Boeing 747. That is a significant statement. L. Harrison Matthews, in his introduction to Darwin's The Origin of Species, said, The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology. And biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. I believe that Dr. Harrison is using accommodative language in saying the fact of evolution is the backbone of biology. He's saying, granting if that is true, then here is a science known as biology that is founded on an unproved theory. He goes on and says, is it then a science or a faith? That is evolution a science or a faith? Then he adds, belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. He's saying that science can't demonstrate in the laboratory either one of these. Darwin said, Charles Darwin himself said before his book was published, and this was in a letter to a colleague regarding the concluding chapters of his book, The Origin of Species, and it's quoted in John Lofton's journal, the Washington Times, the 8th of February, 1984. And Charles Darwin said, "You will be greatly disappointed by the forthcoming book. It will be grievously too hypothetical. It will very likely be of no other service than collocating some facts. Though I myself think I see my way approximately on the origin of the species. But, alas, how frequent, how almost universal it is in an author to persuade himself of the truth of his own dogmas." And then Dr. Colin Patterson, to whom I made reference a while ago, a colleague of Dr. Fred Hoyle's, and Dr. Patterson is senior paleontologist. That means he's a scientist in the field of the study of fossils. And he is the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History in London. And in this letter that he wrote to Dr. Luther Sunderland, we have some words very revealing about Dr. Patterson. And this is quoted in Darwin's Enigma by Luther D. Sunderland, Master Books production of San Diego in the United States, 1984. San Diego, California in the United States, 1984, page 89. Notice what Dr. Patterson said. Now remember, Dr. Patterson abandoned the evolutionary hypothesis along with Dr. Hoyle, so we're told. He said, "It is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test." Then Dr. Patterson said something in a keynote address at the American Museum of Natural History, and being the senior paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History in London, I say that he was qualified to be a speaker and to present the keynote address at the American Museum of Natural History meeting, New York City, the 5th of November, 1981. I read with joy this statement from Dr. Patterson. One of the reasons I started taking this anti-evolutionary view, or let's call it a non-evolutionary view, was last year I had a sudden realization. For over 20 years I had thought I was working on evolution in some way. One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night. And it struck me that I had been working on this stuff for 20 years and there was not one thing I knew about it. That's quite a shock to learn that one can be so misled so long. Either there was something wrong with me or there was something wrong with evolutionary theory. Naturally, I know there's nothing wrong with me. So for the last few weeks I've tried putting a simple question to various people and groups of people. And the question is, he says, and remember, this is the senior paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History addressing an audience assembled at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And he says, here's the question. Can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing. Any one thing that is true. I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and that's a museum in Chicago, a very distinguished museum, where at least 1/5 of the fossils that have been collected are housed. And so he says, I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the Evolutionary Morphology Seminar in the University of Chicago, a very prestigious body of evolutionists, and all I got there was silence for a long time. And eventually one person said, I do know one thing. It ought not to be taught in high school. I think that's a significant statement from Dr. Colin Patterson. Dr. T.N. Thomissian of the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States is quoted as having said, scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men, and the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. Isn't that strange that such bold statements are made by such distinguished men as these from whom I'm quoting? And yet there are other men that are bold in saying that evolution is a fact. Well, they haven't proven that it's a fact, and these men know it. Now I want to talk to you about the evolutionary timetable. This is a very important matter, and I'm going to recite a few things here, paraphrase some of them, but use some of the material from my book, Evolution in the Light of Scripture, Science, and Sense. And under the title Uniformitarianism, I want you to note that the doctrine of uniformitarianism asserts that all geological phenomena may be explained as resulting from observable processes that have always operated in uniform manner. This view holds that the earth has developed and formed gradually and uniformly, purely by natural causes, and that nothing miraculous has occurred, and that nothing like a universal flood as described in Genesis has happened. James Hutton, who died in 1797, was a leading advocate of this view. He was a uniformitarian, and the year that Hutton died, Charles Lyell was born. That is 1797. And Lyell wrote a book later on the subject of geology, in which he stated his views regarding the gradual or natural and uniform development and evolutionary development of the earth. And this book greatly influenced the thinking of geologists. And Lyell's teachings also influenced Charles Darwin. Remember, though, in a previous lesson, I pointed out that Darwin did not depart from the Bible because of discovering scientific matters. After he had turned away from the Bible because he thought there were contradictions in it, he then began to study various views, and one of these was the evolutionary view. And he was influenced by the teachings of Charles Lyell on geology. Evolutionary geologists, that is, uniformitarians, do not agree on the timetable of Earth history. They sometimes differ by billions of years. However, the timetable probably most generally accepted by evolutionists is as follows. First, about 5 billion years ago, the Earth somehow began as a gaseous mass. Second, about 2 billion years ago, rocks began to form from all of this gaseous mass. And I've never read where any evolutionist tried to explain how that happened. Third, about 1/2 billion years ago, or 500 million years ago, life somehow got started. Number 4, during this 1/2 billion years since life forms somehow got started, all life forms evolved, and that includes us human beings. Number 5, in this timetable we observe it was about 1 to 3 million years ago that man evolved. In other words, we human beings are Johnny-come-latelys. We date only to about 1 to 3 million years ago, whereas the first life forms, according to this theory, began about 500 million years ago. Some evolutionists say that man did not evolve from an ape, but that apes and humans evolved from common ancestors. However, many evolutionists say that man did evolve from apes. If you have any doubts about their saying this, I recommend highly that you read the book, it's a classic, entitled Evolution and Christian Faith, written by Dr. Bolton Davidheiser, a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. And Dr. Bolton Davidheiser was an evolutionist, but after he began to study the matter more in his research, he changed his mind. And Johns Hopkins University produced a great scholar graduating from that school and then studying and learning that evolution was not true, wrote this great classical book, and in it he has a long list of quotations from evolutionists who say they believe man evolved from apes. Uniformitarian or evolutionary geologists say that the Earth's crust has been laid down gradually by uniform processes just like the processes we now observe. And yet I don't know how they can observe such processes and how such could be proof of what they say has happened. They say that each layer of the Earth's crust represents a certain geologic time period or geological age. They insist that nothing but natural and uniform processes have caused the Earth's development and present condition. If one thinks of the layers of an onion, he can conceive of the layers of the Earth's crust as evolutionary geologists picture them. And you can see these as demonstrated in the encyclopedias and various scientific works, where the evolutionists present their imaginary timetable. And I'll explain more by what I mean by imaginary timetable, or the geological ages theory. This, however, these layers, talking about these layers of rock strata in the Earth's crust, are not consistent in form or position. This inconsistency presents many problems for the timetable of the evolutionists. Many of the layers of rock are out of sequence. And I pause and state this deliberately because people need to know and understand that there's a big hoax and a massive deception in the books regarding the evolutionary geological timetable. These layers are not in their proper places, often. In many cases, rock that should be on top in the arrangement is found to be on the bottom, and rock that should be on the bottom is found to be on the top. Evolutionists refer to rock as old strata and young strata. Commenting on the inconsistency of the rock layers, Doctors Morris and Whitcomb have said the following in their book, The Genesis Flood. And it is not at all unusual for strata to be found completely out of the approved order, with old strata resting conformably on top of young strata. And all of this, as we have repeatedly emphasized, bears extremely hard on the theory of uniformity and the geologic ages. Now, evolutionists get out of this problem by saying simply, well, there was a big shift. When, for an example, there's a 7,000 square mile slab of rock in north-central United States extending over into Canada, they say, well, that's the results of a big shift. That would be a whopper, wouldn't it? For 7,000 square miles of rock to shift around like that. Evolutionists do not face up to the reality of this problem. I'm going to give you the so-called geological column or timetable as evolutionists present it, and they present it as though it's just exactly that way. They say that the Earth is built up over these long ages, and that the first part of it is known as the Azoic Geological Age. There's 6 of these, and the first one is called the Azoic Geological Age. Now, the Zoic part of that word comes from the Greek word zoe, that means life. That's why we got the word zoology and zoo. And so remember, this means life. The alpha in Greek, corresponding to our A, in front of a word often meant or was a negative prefix. And so azoic would mean not life, or when there was no life. And so they call the first geological age strata Azoic. The second one is called Archaeozoic, or Old Life. The third one is known as Proterozoic, or Fore Life. That seems to me somewhat inconsistent, because Archaeozoic is supposed to be old life, and then on top of that is Proterozoic, that means fore life. Well, they assume there was old life, and then there was life before the life that came in the next part, and that's the Paleozoic. And paleo means ancient, and so the Paleozoic Geological Age, the fourth one coming up from the bottom, is the age of ancient life. Now, this Paleozoic is very significant in the Doctrine of Evolution and the evolutionary timetable, because in it are several geological eras. Note the names of some of these. The first one is the Cambrian. The next one is called the Ordovician, then the Silurian, then the Devonian, and then the Mississippian, and the Pennsylvanian, and the Permian. Now, these are all divisions within the Paleozoic Geological Age. And I'll come back to that. I'll go ahead and name the rest of them and then come back to that. Number 5, coming up from the bottom in this so-called geological column, is the Mesozoic, and meso meaning middle. So this is middle life. It's divided into the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. And then the number 6, geological age, the one on top, allegedly, is called the Cenozoic, which means new life. It's divided, imagine all of these divisions. It is divided into the Paleocene, which lasted approximately 17 million years, we're told, the Eocene, that lasted 19 million years, the Oligocene, that lasted 11 million years. Now, you might find some figures that are different to these, but like I said, they don't mind differing with each other as long as they're all evolutionists. Then the Oligocene being 11 million years, and coming on up then, the next division of the Cenozoic Geological Age is called the Miocene, that lasted, according to evolutionists, 16 million years. And then the Pliocene, that lasted 11 million years, and finally the Pleistocene, which has lasted about 1 million years. And that is where we humans allegedly evolved, at least during part of our evolutionary journey. It took place in the Pleistocene geological era of the Cenozoic Geological Age. Now, some observations. If you read in a book of science or see in an encyclopedia this timetable, this evolutionary geological table or column, you might think, if you didn't know any better, well, surely they've gone out and observed all of these layers of the Earth's crust. But it might come as disappointment to some, and perhaps surprising to others, that evolutionists could not take us to a place in all this world and show us all of these layers in one place. And if they could show us a few of them in one place, they wouldn't necessarily be in the right order. This is wishful thinking. This is an imaginary table to the evolutionists. It is a matter of fact, of course, but they haven't proven it. And there are some inconsistencies in it. As I have said, sometimes the layer of rock is out of place. And it really doesn't matter where it is. It's a certain geological age if it has a certain fossil in it. And these are called index fossils. And maybe a man who believes in evolution, lecturing on this, would say, now this rock is a certain geological age, represents a certain geological age, and you ask, well, you say, he says it's a certain age, and you say, how do you know it is? He said, well, it has this fossil in it. And that determines what geological age it is. That determines the age of it. Now, if you think about it, you may want to ask, well, Professor, you say that rock is a certain age because it has that particular index fossil in it. That's right. You're learning fast. You're catching on. Well, I'm from the country, but I would ask, how do you know the age of the fossil? Oh, don't you see? It's in this rock. We know the age of the fossil because it's in this rock. But you see, he's already said the rock is a certain age because it has this fossil in it. And then he says the fossil is a certain age because it's in this rock. Now, that is known as circular reasoning. And one evolutionist admitted that that is circular reasoning. And really, circular reasoning is not reasoning at all. It's nonsense. And that refutes itself. Then it's quite interesting that in this so-called geological column of the evolutionists, that this Paleozoic Geological Age, which is number 4 up from the bottom, that the first part of it is called the Cambrian Era. And evolutionists say that in the Cambrian rock, they find the fossils, they find fossils of the first living things. Well, now that's interesting, isn't it? Ask an evolutionist if these fossils are fossil forms, and I should explain what a fossil is. Maybe some wouldn't understand. The word fossil is from the Latin infinitive fodere, which means to dig. And you don't have to dig always to find fossils, but that's the general idea, that fossils are found by digging. It is the preserved form of a leaf or of a tree or of a footprint or of an animal or any living thing. And if you'd like a very good categorization of or categorizing of these, you can read in the Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris the various categories of the fossils. And that's interesting, but we're just being general here, and we're saying that fossils are the forms of living things that are left in the earth's crust. Seashells, fish, various types of animals, plants, and so on. Footprints and just whatever has been preserved. And so they tell us that this Cambrian rock, which is the first part or the lowest or the oldest part of the Paleozoic Geological Age, is where they find the fossils of the first life forms. And that these date to about 500 million years ago. Well, there's some interesting questions we need to ask about that. Number one, Mr. Evolutionist, are those fossils the fossils of fully developed forms? Oh, yes, he would answer. Yes, indeed. Oh, I see. Well, if that is true, tell me where they came from. Where can we find their ancestors in the fossil record? Why can't we go just below the Paleozoic Geological Age? That is, just below the Cambrian Geologic Era, which is in the first part of the Paleozoic Geological Age, if those fossils of the first life forms are fossils of fully developed forms, we need to ask, where did they come from? Why can't we dig a little deeper and find the fossils of their ancestors? Now, evolutionists tend to ignore this question or these questions, but they're not facing reality. You see, I'm not saying that fossils teach anything as to origins, but they certainly support the teaching of the Bible on origins, which tell us that living things came into being suddenly. And the fossil record shows us the sudden appearance of fully developed living things. Well, that is not all. In this fossil record, this first fossil record, that is the oldest fossils, we're observing something else. And that is that there are many complex living forms represented there. And we want to observe some of these things. And I want to read some more and maybe paraphrase somewhat from my book, Evolution in the Light of Scripture, Science, and Sense, and observe something about the rocks themselves. Evolutionists date rock strata or rock layers by the kinds of fossils they find in them, and I've already told you that. And Dr. R.H. Rastall, lecturer on geology at Cambridge University, has admitted that this is circular reasoning that I told you about a while ago, that the rocks are dated by the certain fossils in the rocks, and then the fossils are dated because they're in that rock. And of course that's circular reasoning. Evolutionists think that the general arrangement of the fossils in the Earth's crust is evidence that evolution has occurred. The general picture in the fossil record is that the fossils of simpler life forms are at the bottom, and that fossils of higher and more complex forms are found at correspondingly higher levels in the rock and sedimentary structure. That's interesting too, because they classify living things as simple because they're small. But that doesn't prove anything, because small things are not simple. You could take a mosquito. It's very, very complex. It's amazing. I remember reading an article in Reader's Digest about all the parts of a mosquito. As small as it is, it's an amazing creature, so complex. And a chigger is the same way. If I had to make either an elephant or a chigger, I think I would choose making the elephant. The chigger would be awful tedious with all its parts, so small, but they're there nonetheless. Very highly complex. So evolutionists think that this idea of the less complex things, simpler forms, which really are not simple, that this general picture in the fossil record is evidence that evolution has occurred. But actually, it is evidence that a universal flood has occurred. The fossil record appears in the general order that we would expect it to appear if it was laid down by the action of water and by the action of shifting, bulging Earth's crust, actions which undoubtedly occurred during the flood of Noah's time. And undoubtedly there were great tidal waves caused by great earthquakes. In the Bible we read about how not only the waters came down from the heavens, the windows of heaven were opened, And the Bible tells us the fountains of the great deep were broken up. And I am convinced that we have not comprehended the ideas that are suggested in that one statement. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. Another place that same Hebrew word for broken up is used in the Bible refers to the breaking up of the shell of an egg in the book of Isaiah. My beloved, God Almighty, during this awful event known as the flood of Genesis, took this earth, as it were, and crushed it, like you and I might crush a hen's egg, breaking the crust on it. We are not fully aware, we have not fully comprehended the great tidal waves that would have been caused by such upheavals in the earth's crust. And so the avalanches, the sudden inundations, and all of this taking place, forming the earth's crust as it is generally observed with the fossil record in it, of living forms being preserved in such. The general order of the fossil record shows that life forms less capable to escape the rising waters of the flood and to escape the avalanches of shifting earth and rock and the mass movements of molten rock are on the bottom in the fossil record. The more capable and more complex forms are found correspondingly higher up in the rock and generally sedimentary structure and the general sedimentary structure. The following is an appropriate commentary on this point, and is from Morris and Whitcomb's book. Dr. John Morris, Dr. Henry Morris, and Dr. John Whitcomb wrote this book, The Genesis Flood, and I want you to notice what they observed about this. They say in other localities, and perhaps somewhat later in the period of the rising waters of the flood, in general, land animals and plants would be expected to be caught in the sediments and buried. And this, of course, is exactly what the strata show. Of course, this would be only a general rule, and there would be many exceptions, as currents would be intermingling from all directions, particularly as the lands become increasingly submerged and more amphibians, reptiles, and mammals were overtaken by the waters. One would certainly not expect to find in any one locality a continuous series of all the possible types of strata. The actual deposits would depend on the local circumstances of current direction and sediment source areas and the manner in which these changed during the course of the flood period. Then they add, and finally for this lesson, in general, though, as a statistical average, beds would tend to be deposited in just the order that has been ascribed to them in terms of the standard geologic column. That is, on top of the beds of marine vertebrates would be found amphibians, then reptiles, and finally birds and mammals. This is the order. Number one, of increasing mobility and therefore increasing ability to postpone inundation. Number two, of decreasing density and other hydrodynamic factors or water power factors tending to promote earlier and deeper sedimentation. And third, of increasing elevation of habitat and therefore time required for the flood to attain stages sufficient to overtake them. The order is exactly what is to be expected in the light of the flood account, and therefore gives further circumstantial evidence of the truthfulness of this account. In no sense is it necessary to say that this order is evidence of organic evolution from one stage into the next. and the fact that although this order is generally to be expected, it is found to have many exceptions, both in terms of omissions and inversions, is also certainly to be expected in terms of deluge events, but is extremely difficult to account for logically in terms of evolution and uniformity. That's the end of the statement by Dr. Morris and Dr. Whitcomb. And to me, all of this evidence is overwhelming evidence that the general structure, I'm not saying that all of it can be attributed to the flood of Genesis, for there have been many other events that could have formed some of the sedimentary strata. And of course that continues with earthquakes, tidal waves, and so on. But I'm saying that all of this is good evidence that the general structure of the fossil record that we observe in the Earth's crust must have been laid down by the sudden and catastrophic action of a universal flood. In the next lesson, I want to present reasons why we can believe confidently that the flood was indeed universal, along with some other matters related to that, and then we'll study some things further concerning God's work and contrasting it with the evolutionary hypothesis. And soon we'll be into the study of God's Word and then God's Son. Remember, our course is divided into 4 areas: God's existence, God's work, God's Word, and God's Son.